April 14, 1943. A coded Japanese message crosses the Pacific Ocean. American cryptologists at Pearl Harbor crack it in less than 24 hours. What they find inside is unprecedented. The exact itinerary of the most wanted man in the Pacific theater, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had humiliated the United States Navy and killed 2,403 Americans on a Sunday morning. In 4 days, Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville. The message contained everything: his departure time, his arrival time, the type of aircraft he would be flying in, the number of escort fighters protecting him. The Americans knew exactly when he would arrive, down to the minute. What followed was the longest fighter intercept mission in military history. 16 P-38 Lightnings, 1,000 miles round trip over open ocean, 6 minutes of fuel remaining over the target. Navigation so precise, they would arrive 1 minute early after flying 400 miles with nothing but a compass and a wristwatch. And a controversy that would last 80 years. 2 pilots would claim the kill. Only one could be telling the truth. The dispute would outlive them both. This is the story of Operation Vengeance, the day America executed the man who had warned Japan never to wake a sleeping giant. The message that would kill Admiral Yamamoto was designated NTF 13171755. It was encrypted using JN25D, the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code. The Japanese believed this cipher was unbreakable. They were wrong. American code breakers had been reading Japanese naval communications since before Pearl Harbor. The intelligence failure that allowed December 7th to happen was not a failure of cryptanalysis. It was a failure of interpretation and communication. But by April 1943, the system was working. The intercept station at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, picked up the message first. It was immediately forwarded to Fleet Radio Unit Pacific F. FERT UPAC, the code-breaking operation headquartered at Pearl Harbor. The cryptanalysts went to work. Among them was a young Navy officer named John Paul Stevens. Decades later, he would become a Supreme Court justice, serving 35 years on the nation's highest court. In April 1943, he was just another brilliant young man reading Japanese secrets. The message was from the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul. It detailed an inspection tour by the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The itinerary was precise to the minute. Admiral Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 on April 18th. He would fly in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the Americans called it a Betty, escorted by 60 fighters. He would arrive at Balala Airfield near Bougainville at 0800. The message even specified that Yamamoto would be wearing his dress whites. The Japanese had handed the Americans everything they needed. The only question was whether anyone would act on it. The decoded message reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, within hours. Nimitz immediately recognized both the opportunity and the risk. Killing Yamamoto would be a significant blow to Japanese morale. He was not just an admiral. He was a symbol, the man who had conceived and executed the Pearl Harbor attack, the most famous military figure in Japan. His death would shake the empire. But there was a danger. If the Japanese realized their codes had been broken, they would change them immediately. The intelligence advantage that had helped win the Battle of Midway, that was helping win the entire Pacific War, would evaporate overnight. Nimitz consulted with his intelligence officers. Could an intercept mission be plausibly explained without revealing the code break? The answer was yes, barely. Coast watchers could have spotted Yamamoto's departure from Rabaul. Lucky reconnaissance could have picked up the flight. The cover story was thin, but it might hold. Nimitz forwarded the intelligence to Washington. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox brought it directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. According to some accounts, Roosevelt's response was immediate: "Get Yamamoto." Whether those exact words were spoken remains debated. What is certain is that authorization came back quickly. The mission was approved at the highest levels of the American government. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Forces, received the order. His message to the planning staff was characteristically blunt. "Trally ho, let's jet the bastard." The mission was designated Operation Vengeance. The name said everything about what this was. Not strategy, not tactics, revenge. But here is what most Americans did not know in 1943, and what many still do not understand today. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had opposed the war with the United States from the beginning. He had spent years in America. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1991. He served as a naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He traveled the country extensively. He understood American industrial capacity in a way that few Japanese officers did. He knew that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. He said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. In 1940, when the Japanese government was debating whether to ally with Nazi Germany and confront American power, Yamamoto warned the Prime Minister directly. He said, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year. But I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." 6 months. That was all he promised. After that, he expected defeat. The Japanese government ignored him. They signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. They continued their expansion into Southeast Asia. When diplomacy failed, they ordered Yamamoto to plan the attack that would begin the war. He did so brilliantly. The Pearl Harbor attack was his conception, the massed carrier strike. The emphasis on aircraft over battleships, the audacity of striking across 4,000 miles of ocean. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution. And it was, Yamamoto knew, ultimately futile. After Pearl Harbor, he became the most hated man in America, but he never believed Japan would win. He had told them exactly what would happen, and by April 1943, it was happening. Japan had lost the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers, the heart of the striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were at the bottom of the Pacific. The Americans were advancing through the Solomon Islands. The war that Yamamoto had warned against was being lost exactly as he had predicted. The man America wanted dead more than any other was the same man who had tried to prevent the war from happening at all. Now 16 American fighters were being prepared to kill him. The mission planners faced a nearly impossible challenge. Yamamoto's destination was Balale Airfield, a small Japanese base near Bougainville. The nearest American fighter base was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the same airfield that Marines had fought and died to capture just months earlier. The distance from Henderson Field to the intercept point was approximately 400 miles. That meant an 800-mile round trip over open ocean through Japanese-controlled airspace. The Navy and Marine fighters available at Henderson Field could not make this flight. The F-4F Wildcat had a combat radius of about 200 miles. The new F-4U Corsair was better, but still insufficient. No single-engine American fighter had the range for this mission. There was only one option, the Army Air Force's P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unusual. Twin engines, twin-tail booms, a distinctive profile that Japanese pilots called the fork-tailed devil. It was fast over 400 miles per hour and heavily armed, with 4.5 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose. Most importantly, it had range. With external drop tanks, a P-38 could fly over 1,000 miles, just barely enough. But there were only 18 P-38s available in the South Pacific, and 2 of those were down for maintenance. That left 16 aircraft for a mission with no margin for error. A direct flight from Henderson Field to the intercept point would cover approximately 400 miles. But the mission planners could not take the direct route. The Japanese had radar installations and coast watcher networks throughout the Solomon Islands. A formation of American fighters flying toward Bougainville at altitude would be detected long before they reached the target. Yamamoto's plane would be warned. The mission would fail. The solution was to fly the long way around. Instead of heading directly northwest toward Bougainville, the P-38s would fly southwest first, then turn west, then finally north, making a wide arc over the open ocean, staying at least 50 miles from any Japanese-held island. And they would fly the entire route at 50 feet above the water. At 50 feet, they would be below Japanese radar. No coast watcher would spot them against the dark ocean surface. They would be invisible until the moment they arrived at the intercept point. The roundabout route added 200 miles to the flight. The total distance 600 miles outbound, 400 miles return, 1,000 miles round trip. The P-38's maximum range with drop tanks was approximately 1,100 miles. That left a margin of 100 miles, less than 10%. If they encountered headwinds, they might not make it home. If they had to engage in extended combat, burning fuel and afterburner, they would certainly run out. Mission planners calculated that the fighters would have no more than 6 minutes over the target area. 6 minutes to find Yamamoto, kill him, and escape. The man responsible for getting 16 fighters to a precise point in the sky at a precise moment in time was Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 39th Fighter Squadron. Mitchell was 30 years old, the experienced pilot who had been flying P-38s since the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. He would lead the mission personally. The navigation problem was extraordinary. There would be no landmarks for most of the flight, nothing but open ocean. There would be no radio communication. The Japanese might intercept any transmission. There would be no radar to show them their position. Mitchell would have to fly 600 miles, make several course changes, and arrive at a specific point in the sky at exactly 0935, all using nothing but a compass, an airspeed indicator, and his wristwatch. This was dead reckoning navigation in its purest form. Calculate your heading, calculate your ground speed, time each leg precisely, trust your instruments even when you cannot see land for hours. Any error would be fatal to the mission. Arrive too early and Yamamoto's flight might not yet be there. Arrive too late and he would already be on the ground at Bougainville. Arrive in the wrong location and they would never find him at all. Mitchell plotted the course by hand. 5 legs, 265 degrees for 183 miles, then 290 degrees for 88 miles, then 305 degrees for 125 miles, then a dogleg north for the final intercept. He calculated the timing down to the minute. At 0935, they would arrive at the southern tip of Bougainville Island. At that exact moment, Yamamoto's bomber should be descending toward Bougainville, 10 miles away. If Yamamoto was on schedule. If Mitchell's calculations were correct. If nothing went wrong. At 07:10, on the morning of April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year and 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 18 P-38 Lightnings began their takeoff roll at Henderson Field, 2 aircraft aborted almost immediately. One had a blown tire. Another had a mechanical problem with its drop tanks. That left 16 fighters exactly as planned, but with no reserves. Major Mitchell led the formation. The 16 aircraft dropped to 50 feet above the water and turned southwest away from Bougainville, beginning the long arc that would bring them to the intercept point from an unexpected direction. Radio silence was absolute. The pilots could not communicate with each other, with Henderson Field, or with anyone else. For the next 2 hours, they would fly in formation, watching their instruments, trusting Mitchell's navigation. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath them. No ships, no islands, nothing but water and sky. At the altitude they were flying, there was no room for error. A moment's inattention could put an aircraft into the water. Pilots who fell behind could not call for help. The formation maintained visual contact, each pilot watching the aircraft ahead, holding position through sheer concentration. Mitchell made his first turn at the calculated time, then his second, then his third. The formation followed, blind to their position, trusting that the mathematics would bring them where they needed to be. At 0934, 1 hour and 54 minutes after takeoff, Mitchell saw land ahead. It was Bougainville. They had arrived exactly where Mitchell had calculated, exactly when he had predicted. 1 minute early, the navigation had been perfect. The 16 P-38s climbed from 50 feet to 2,000 feet, spreading out to scan the sky ahead. They were looking for 2 Betty bombers and 60 escorts. They had to find them in the next few minutes, or Yamamoto would land safely at Bougainville. At 0935, one of the pilots called out the contact. 2 bombers at 10 o'clock, low, descending toward the airfield. 6 fighters above and behind them. This was it. But there was a problem. The intelligence had indicated 1 bomber carrying Yamamoto. There were 2 bombers. Which one was the target? There was no time to decide. Mitchell had divided his force into 2 elements, a killer flight of 4 aircraft assigned to attack the bombers, and a cover flight of 12 aircraft to keep the Zero escorts occupied. The killer flight consisted of 4 pilots: Captain Thomas Lanphier, First Lieutenant Rex Barber, First Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and First Lieutenant Raymond Heim. Mitchell gave the order. The killer flight dove toward the bombers. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be debated for 8 decades. Captain Lanphier, leading the killer flight, later claimed that he immediately engaged the Zero escorts, shooting down several fighters before turning to attack one of the bombers. According to Lanphier's account, he chased a Betty toward the jungle and shot it down, watching it crash and burn. Lieutenant Barber told a different story. According to Barber, Lanphier broke toward the Zeros almost immediately, leaving Barber alone to attack the bombers. Holmes and Hine had trouble jettisoning their drop tanks, a mechanical failure that made them too slow to catch the descending bombers. Barber pursued the lead Betty by himself. He closed to within yards of the bomber and opened fire with his .450 caliber machine guns and his 20mm cannon. He saw his rounds tear through the right engine and the fuselage. Pieces began falling from the aircraft. The Betty's right wing separated from the fuselage. The bomber rolled and plunged into the jungle canopy, disappearing in a ball of fire. Barber then attacked the second Betty, which was attempting to escape by diving toward the water. He hit this aircraft as well, sending it crashing into the ocean. In the chaos of the air battle, with Zeros now engaging the Americans, the exact sequence of events was impossible to determine. Lanphier claimed he shot down the bomber carrying Yamamoto. Barber insisted that he did. Only one thing was certain: at least one of the Betty bombers had crashed into the jungle. The mission had succeeded, or at least the Americans believed it had. They would not know for certain until they learned whether Yamamoto was dead. The fighters turned for home. One P-38 had been shot down. Lieutenant Hine, last seen with a Zero on his tail, never returned. The remaining 15 aircraft flew the 400 miles back to Henderson Field, most of them landing with nearly empty fuel tanks. Some barely made it. One pilot's engines died on the runway as the last fuel drained away. But they had done it. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was dead. Or so they believed. Thomas Lanphier was certain he had killed Yamamoto. He radioed his claim before he even landed at Henderson Field. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House," he reportedly said. Lanphier's claim was initially accepted. He was credited with the kill. He was decorated and celebrated, becoming one of the most famous fighter pilots of the Pacific War. But Rex Barber never stopped insisting that Lanphier was wrong. According to Barber, Lanphier had engaged the Zeros and never fired on the bombers at all. Barber had been the only pilot in position to attack. The kill was his. The dispute intensified over the years. Both pilots wrote accounts of the mission. Both gave interviews. Both accused the other of lying. The Air Force conducted multiple investigations, but never reached a definitive conclusion. Then, decades later, new evidence emerged. The Japanese conducted an autopsy on Yamamoto's body after recovering it from the jungle crash site. The autopsy showed that Yamamoto had been killed by 2 gunshot wounds, one to his left shoulder, one that entered his lower jaw and exited through his right eye. The crucial detail was the angle. The bullets had entered from behind and slightly below. This was consistent with Barber's account. He had described attacking the Betty from the rear, firing from below as he closed on the bomber. If Barber was the shooter, the bullet trajectories made sense. Lanphier had described attacking from the side. If his account was accurate, the bullets would have struck Yamamoto from a different angle. There was also the testimony of a surviving Japanese Zero pilot who had witnessed the attack. He described seeing an American fighter attack the lead Betty from the rear exactly as Barber had described. In 2024, an Air Force historian who had previously supported Lanphier's claim changed his position. After reviewing all the evidence, he concluded that Rex Barber, not Thomas Lanphier, had shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. But Lanphier had died in 1987, still insisting he was right. Barber died in 2001, his claim finally gaining acceptance. Neither man lived to see the controversy fully resolved. The Japanese knew almost immediately that something had gone wrong. When Yamamoto's aircraft failed to arrive at WWII on schedule, search parties were dispatched. The next morning, April 19th, a Japanese army unit found the crash site in the jungle north of Bougainville. The scene was haunting. The Betty bomber had torn through the jungle canopy and come to rest relatively intact, broken but recognizable. Around it lay the bodies of the crew, and in a seat that had been thrown clear of the wreckage, still strapped in, was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His body was upright, as if he was still seated in the aircraft. His white-gloved hands still gripped the hilt of his ceremonial katana. His uniform, the dress whites mentioned in the intercepted message, was almost undamaged. He had been killed, instantly. The 2-bullet wound, shoulder and head, had caused immediate death. He had likely never known the attack was happening. The Japanese cremated his remains in Bougainville, then transported the ashes back to Japan. A state funeral was held in Tokyo on June 5, 1943. It was the largest funeral in Japanese history to that point, with over 1 million people lining the streets. The emperor himself attended. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to fleet admiral and awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum. The propaganda value of his death was enormous in both directions. The Japanese used his martyrdom to inspire continued resistance. The Americans used his death to demonstrate that no one was beyond their reach. The mission was a military success, but what followed was an intelligence disaster. The American military desperately wanted to keep the code-breaking secret. If the Japanese discovered that JN-25D had been compromised, they would change their codes immediately. The intelligence advantage that had helped win Midway, and that was helping win the entire Pacific War, would be lost. A cover story was prepared. American coast watchers had spotted Yamamoto's departure from Rabaul. A reconnaissance aircraft had happened to observe the flight. It was all luck and good fortune, not code-breaking. The cover story held for a few months. Then, in October 1943, Time magazine published a detailed account of the mission. The article named Thomas Lanphier as the pilot who killed Yamamoto. It described the mission in considerable detail, too much detail. The Navy was furious. The article came dangerously close to revealing the code-breaking secret. If Japanese intelligence analyzed the American knowledge of Yamamoto's itinerary, they might realize their codes were compromised. The consequences extended to the pilots themselves. Major John Mitchell had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary navigation and leadership. After the Time article, his nomination was downgraded to a Navy Cross. The Navy did not want additional attention focused on the mission. Fortunately for the Americans, the Japanese never fully realized the implications. They attributed Yamamoto's death to bad luck or a security breach in Rabaul. They did not discover that their naval codes had been broken, but the risk had been enormous. A magazine article nearly undid one of the greatest intelligence advantages of the war. What difference did Yamamoto's death actually make? In immediate tactical terms, it removed the most capable Japanese naval commander from the war. Yamamoto was not replaced by anyone of equal skill. His successors, Admiral Mainichi Koga, then Admiral Somu Toyota, were competent officers, but neither possessed Yamamoto's strategic vision or his ability to inspire. Japanese naval operations became more cautious after Yamamoto's death. The aggressive strike mentality that had characterized the early war diminished. American admirals noticed the difference, but the larger impact was psychological. Yamamoto had been more than an admiral. He was a symbol of Japanese military prowess, the man who had humbled the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor. His death shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. If America could reach out across hundreds of miles and kill the most protected man in the Japanese military, then no one was safe. The mission also demonstrated something important about American capabilities. The navigation feat alone, 600 miles over open ocean, arriving 1 minute early at a precise point in the sky, showed a level of precision and training that Japanese commanders had not expected. And there was the deeper irony that Yamamoto himself would have appreciated. He had warned Japan that a war with America would end in disaster. He had predicted 6 months of success, followed by inevitable defeat. He had been right about everything. By April 1943, Japan had lost the offensive. Guadalcanal had fallen. Midway had broken the carrier force. The vast American industrial machine was producing ships and planes faster than Japan could possibly match. Yamamoto died, proving his own prophecy. The war he had warned against was being lost, exactly as he had predicted. The sleeping giant he had awakened was now fully awake, and it was coming for Japan. On April 18, 1943, 16 American fighter pilots flew 600 miles across the Pacific Ocean to kill one man. They had no radar. They had no landmarks. They had no radar communication. They had nothing but a compass, an airspeed indicator, and a wristwatch. Major John Mitchell calculated the intercept to the minute. He plotted 5 course changes by hand. He led his formation at 50 feet above the water, below Japanese radar for nearly 2 hours. They arrived 1 minute early. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was mathematics and courage and discipline, executed under impossible conditions by young men who understood that any mistake would mean failure or death. Rex Barber dove on a Betty bomber and killed the man inside it. The controversy over who fired the fatal shots lasted 80 years. The evidence now suggests that Barber was telling the truth all along. He never received the recognition he deserved in his lifetime. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died in the jungle of Bougainville, still holding his sword, still wearing his dress whites. He was the most wanted man in the Pacific theater. He was also the man who had tried hardest to prevent the war from happening. He had studied at Harvard. He had traveled across America. He understood exactly what his country was facing. He told his government that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. They ordered him to plan Pearl Harbor anyway. 6 months, he promised. 6 months, he promised. 6 months of victory. After that, nothing. He gave them 6 months. Then America came for him. The message that killed him was intercepted, decoded, and acted upon in 4 days. The mission that killed him was planned, approved, and executed in less than a week. The pilots who killed him flew 1,000 miles round trip on the edge of their fuel limits. Every element of Operation Vengeance demonstrated what Yamamoto had tried to tell his country. American intelligence, American technology, American technology, American precision, American will. He had warned them the sleeping giant was dangerous. Once awakened, it would not stop until victory was complete. They did not listen. So he gave them Pearl Harbor because he was a soldier, and those were his orders. And then he waited, knowing what was coming, knowing how it would end. On April 18, 1943, it ended for him. The Americans found him because they had broken his codes. They killed him because they could fly 400 miles and arrive at the exact right place at the exact right time. They escaped because they were better trained and better equipped than the Japanese fighters sent to stop them. Every advantage Yamamoto had warned about, every strength he had feared, all of it came together on a single morning over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor died, proving his own prophecy. He had awakened a sleeping giant, and the giant reached out across the Pacific and killed him. 1 year, 4 months, and 11 days after the attack that had started it all. This was Operation Vengeance. 18 aircraft, 400 miles of ocean, 6 minutes of fuel. 1 minute early, and a controversy that outlived everyone who flew the mission. Rex Barber died in 2001, still insisting he had fired the fatal shots. Thomas Lanphier died in 1987, still claiming the kill. The Air Force changed its position years after both men were gone, but Major John Mitchell's navigation was never disputed. 600 miles of dead reckoning, no landmarks, no radio, no radar. He put 16 fighters exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. That was the real miracle of Operation Vengeance. Not the killing that was simply violence, but the navigation, the planning, the precision that was something else. That was the kind of enemy Yamamoto had warned Japan about, and they had not listened.